That's 2.7 billion people to add to our audience. You're welcome as well to our invited policy session as the sun sets over Europe and rises over Silicon Valley. We will be talking about the simple macroeconomics of AI for the next 90 minutes. The format is pretty simple. For the first 30 minutes, Daron will be presenting his new work. There will be remarks by Benoit, who is on my left shoulder here, and also online by David. Then we will all have the opportunity to discuss that for the remainder of the time. So I will get out of the way now. Daron, you are welcome to start your presentation.
Should I get started? Okay. All right. Well, let me first share my presentation. It's my pleasure to be here, despite the tech issues. And sorry I couldn't be there. I can't be there in person, but I'm really happy to be able to talk to all of you and get your comments on the macroeconomic effects of AI. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, there are some simple restrictions that basic macroeconomic theory places on how big the effects of AI can be in the near future. This is, of course, against the background of amazing excitement about generative AI, even some as early as 1 year ago, writing articles about sparks of artificial intelligence, and some people are expecting huge economic gains approaching singularity within the next 10 years. More modestly, organizations such as Goldman Sachs, McKinsey are predicting anywhere between 1.5 percentage point to 3.4 percentage point increase in annual economic growth thanks to AI, especially generative AI. So I want to investigate whether such large effects are possible and plausible, and if there are going to be productivity gains, and who will be their beneficiary. So what I'm going to do is, of course, admitting that this is a very, very difficult problem to predict because the capabilities and impact of generative AI is still highly uncertain. There is quite a bit we can say. So I'm going to use the task-based framework from my work with Pasquale Restrepo and show that, in fact, there's a version of the Halton's theorem that applies in this and all related environments, where TFP and GDP consequences of AI are given by cost savings or productivity improvement at the microeconomic level, at the task level, weighted up by the GDP share of these tasks. If you do this calculation and then draw on estimates that are in the literature on what tasks are going to be exposed to AI, under reasonable assumptions, you end up with something like 4.6% of US tasks likely impacted over 10 years. And on the basis of a number of recent experimental studies, no more than about 15% cost savings at the task level. So if you put these two together, you get an upper bound of 0.7 percentage point increase in TFP over 10 years. So that's less than 0.07% annual TFP growth. So nothing even in the vicinity of either the singularity claims or of the more modest but still aggressive claims from many organizations, publications such as The Economist and many forecasters. I then argue why these numbers are likely to be overestimates, because early evidence comes from what I'm going to call easy to learn tasks, where outside learning can be quite effective because there are measurable outcome metrics and low dimensional mapping from actions to outcomes, whereas many of the exposed tasks are actually hard tasks. And I'll talk a little bit about bad new tasks, deepfakes, manipulation, cybercrime, and how they will affect the macroeconomic predictions. But perhaps as important as the productivity effects are the inequality points. And here I'm going to make 2 points. One is a theoretical point because, most of the paper, the rest of the paper is using very simple equations and trying to make advances in putting some numbers on them. But this theoretical point is important because it's often misunderstood by many who are both outside and inside the economics community. In particular, there is a set of arguments that many people have made on the basis that in some experimental studies, it's the lower expertise, lower performing workers that benefit more from given access to generative AI tools, that this will actually reduce inequality. Theoretically, I'll show you that in the general task framework, that's not true. Convergence of productivities in some tasks does not imply lower inequality. It might actually easily lead to higher inequality, and I'll explain why that is the case. Empirically, I'll use the setup of my work with Pascual Restrepo, and I'll estimate that there are no big increases in inequality between education groups, in contrast to pre-AI automation, because I'll show you that exposure to AI is much more equally distributed across demographic groups. But in fact, there is also no decline in labor income inequality. In fact, low education, white, native-born women are predicted to experience declines in real wages, and the gap between capital and labor income is likely to increase. So much of the optimism about the macroeconomics of AI, I think, within the next 10 years are hard to ground. All right, let me jump onto the conceptual framework. This is direct from my work with Pascual Restrepo with just some very minor expositional modification. Think of a unique final good, Y, produced by combining task services from a range of tasks which I normalize to lie between 0 and n. Sigma is the elasticity of substitution between tasks. So in practice, that's a very low number. You need to complete a lot of tasks in order to produce, say, something like a piece of garment or a car. There is little substitution between tasks. In fact, in the data, think of sigma as something like 0.05. Each task can be performed or produced using either capital or labor. Later, I'll distinguish between different types of labor. So here, AL is a labor augmenting productivity term, the standard thing that macroeconomists assume. AK is capital augmenting, but what's important is these gamma LZ and gamma KZ, which determine the comparative advantage of capital and labor. Suppose that gamma LZ over gamma KZ is increasing, just a normalization or reordering of tasks, so that there exists some threshold I such that tasks below I will be performed by capital, those above will be performed by labor. There's a labor clearing equation. Total amount of labor, which I take to be inelastically supplied, has to be assigned between tasks. And then I'm going to assume that new machinery is produced out of output. So as a result, a competitive equilibrium is a very simple object. The allocation of all tasks is going to be cost minimizing. That means that a task is going to be produced by labor if and only if wage divided by the effective productivity of labor, AL over gamma LZ, is less than the cost of capital for that task, RZ, divided by the productivity of capital. The amount of capital is going to be chosen to maximize net output, Y minus RZ times KZ, and the overall and the labor market is going to clear. You can easily show under mild conditions that an equilibrium exists and is unique. And I'm just going to take that equilibrium and I'm going to introduce AI advances into that equilibrium. So what can AI do within this framework? Well, it can do 4 distinct type of things. And let me enumerate them and then explain which ones I'm going to focus on. First, it can induce further extensive margin automation, meaning that either because it increases gamma KZ or reduces the cost of capital, it raises the threshold task below which things are automated or performed by capital. That's the focus. That's been the focus of my work with Pascual Restrepo. It can create task complementarities, meaning that it can increase the productivity of labor in some tasks that are already produced by labor, for example. This could be because AI provides better information to people in the performance of their job. Or I'll explain in the context of the experimental studies, this could happen indirectly. It can automate some subtasks and enable workers to actually specialize within tasks into parts of the jobs where perhaps their productivity increases. I think my interpretation of some of the micro studies that have come out over the last years is that these task complementarities could be important. It could deepen automation, meaning that it can improve gamma kz in previously capital-intensive tasks. So if you're already using robots, robots may get better. That might happen, but I'm going to argue that's not an important thing within the next 10 years. New labor-intensive tasks and new products. That's a very, very important role of AI, but I'll come back at the end to argue why we're not seeing much of that at the moment, and I don't forecast seeing much in the next 10 years. So I'm going to focus on automation and task complementarities. Another thing that I'm not focusing on, again, not likely within the next 10 years, is the complete revolutionary changes in science. Perhaps after 10 years, I'm not super optimistic, but it could happen within the next 10 years. I think there's very little likelihood of that. Now, the key object that I'm going to use here is something several of you know. It goes by the name of Halton, since the first person to explore this, even in a more interesting setting with input-output linkages, was Charles Halton. And essentially, what it says is that in a competitive and efficient environment, if you want to know what's happening to aggregate TFP, then it's enough to take productivity changes at the sectoral, or in my setting, it would be at the task level, and then weight them up by the GDP share. And here is the simple proof. Write output as price-weighted sum of tasks. That's just an alternative way of writing aggregate output in this one sector economy. And then proportional change in output is these shares here times proportional change in task performance. So this you can take as given in an efficient equilibrium. That was Halton's key observation. That's like a Lagrange multiplier. So therefore, change in TFP or change in output holding capital stock constant is just chi z times pi lz, where pi lz is the productivity improvement or cost savings in labor costs from AI, and chi z is the GDP share of task z. So this is the equation I'm going to use in a second empirically. Total effect on GDP then is simply TFP effect plus change in the capital share, change in the capital stock times the capital share in national income. All right, what about AI's inequality effects in theory? If AI is used for automation, it always increases capital labor income inequality. This is a major emphasis point of my work with Pascual. There's some special cases where this may not happen, but they're very, very unlikely. So that's why I said always. Wage effects will depend on productivity gains, which is what I'm going to estimate via the Halton theorem. The impact on labor income inequality, as I'm going to emphasize, depends on the distribution of exposure across demographic groups. If in addition there are task complementarities, then what's going to matter a lot is the elasticity of substitution between tasks. But I said for realistic cases, this is a number less than 1. So what happens then is that when you improve productivity through task complementarities in an occupation, for example, then you will need less labor in that occupation because of sigma being less than 1. So then the general equilibrium effects of inequality are very different than what you see at the task level. Why? So imagine, for example, that I suddenly make low-skill cab drivers much more productive relative to high-skill cab drivers. But as a result of that, I need fewer cab drivers. That means that a lot of people are going to get reallocated away from cab driving. If that happens, inequality consequences will be determined by the gap between high-performing and low-performing, or high-skill versus low-skill paper workers in the new occupations they are going into. And there is no guarantee that convergence of productivities in affected tasks will mean there will be convergence in productivities in unaffected tasks, or the productivity gap in unaffected tasks can be very large. So it's very easy to generate examples where inequality can increase a lot, even when within task productivities converge between high skill and low skill workers. So let me now jump onto a discussion of how I'm going to put numbers into this. For the first part, I need just 2 sets of numbers. I need GDP share of tasks that are impacted by AI within the next 10 years, and then I need average labor cost savings. So how I'm going to get the GDP share of tasks? So there have been several papers. I think the best one, the very detailed one by Elundu, Pamela Mishkin, Daniel Rock, and co-authors, uses a variety of strategies to code O-net tasks in terms of their exposure to a hypothetical LLM tool. I mean my hypothetical LLM tool because they are thinking of a current crop of LLMs, further advances, software built on it, and computer vision technologies that go somewhat with LLM, but are also a distinct class. So I'm going to take their numbers with some small adjustments. I'm going to aggregate up these numbers to occupation level. And then I'm going to use wage bill shares from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, meaning how much spending on labor there is across occupations to get a GDP weighted task share. And that comes to about 20% of all tasks performed in the United States. But these are exposed tasks in some hypothetical future. Elundu et al. Don't say that this will happen within 10 years, and they don't say that this is actually profitable. So some tasks may be exposed to AI, meaning that AI may perform it, but it might actually be more costly because of quality concerns or other concerns than humans performing it. Another recent paper by Svanberg, Thompson et al. Zeroes in on computer vision technologies and asks this complementary question. What fraction of tasks exposed to computer vision technologies can be profitably and feasibly automated within 10 years? So they come up with a number like 23%. And I'm going to take this number and I'm going to apply it to all the tasks by Elundu et al., even though this number is just for computer vision, but computer vision and other generative AI are mixed in Elundu et al., and there is no reason for me to think computer vision is systematically different, but I don't have any reason to know what the difference would be either because there's no study that does that. But in any case, given the data limitations, that's the only thing we can do. But if we do this, the overall result is an upper bound, and I'll explain why it's an upper bound of 4.6 tasks impacted in the next 10 years. It's an upper bound because I make in the process a number of assumptions that are that try to be as generous to exposure as possible. So that's the number for exposure. What about average cost savings? So there I'm going to rely on two papers, one by Shket Noy and Whitney Zhang on simple writing tasks in an experimental setting online. They give access to ChatGPT to some workers and not to others. The other one by Eric Brynjolfsson, Danielle Lee, and Lindsay Raymond. That is a large-scale workplace generative AI adoption for customer service associates. And both studies find time savings from the use of generative AI. Both of them find this pattern that I said, that is the lower performing workers that benefit more. And my interpretation, which is in line, consistent with the author's interpretation, in both cases, what's going on is that generative AI tools are automating some of the tasks that individuals were doing, so then individuals are spending time on other things. Whether there is actual specialization or not, that I can't see, but there's some amount of complementarity, I think, overall. They find, on average, cost savings of 27%. That's labor cost savings. What we care about is total cost savings. So then I compute total cost savings by taking the labor shares in exposed industries, and then I arrive to a number just over 15.4%. Yeah. All right, so now we can use our first pass using Halton's theorem. So here is the version of Halton's theorem that I had before, but simplified, just for writing it now. It's the same essence. It's the GDP share of impacted by AI over the next 10 years times average cost savings of impacted tasks, 0.46 times 0.154. That's the basis of the number that over 10 years. It's a less than 1 percentage point increase in TFB, about less than 3/4 of a percentage point increase in TFB. So the nice thing about this is it's so transparent. You can disagree with me, either because you disagree about this number or you disagree about this number, and we can think about how we can increase these numbers if you're so inclined. But it's also quite obvious from this discussion, it's going to be very hard to go much above 0.07 annually, which is really a small effect. If you want to add other higher productivity estimates, there's one for Java and so on programmers from Peng Demirer et al. If you do that, you might increase by about 25%. You're still less than 1%. Swanberg et al. Incorporate in some of their estimates potential declines in GPU costs. If you do that again, you are around less than 1%. And I think it's not right to the projections that they are building on for GPU costs are too optimistic, but we can talk about that in the discussion if people are interested. But I think the bigger issue here, and I think this is a conceptual issue that I hope others will pick up on as well, is that there is a big distinction between easy to learn and hard to learn tasks. How to boil an egg or how to write a computer subroutine are easy tasks for outside learning. Why? Because there's an outside generally agreed metric. If your egg is not boiled or it's too hard, that's not a good egg boiling strategy. If your computer subroutine doesn't run, it's not good. So we have an outside metric. Those are the kinds of things that any outside learning, including by machine learning and deep learning algorithms, can actually work with. In addition, if there's a simple low-dimensional mapping between actions and outcomes given context, that helps as well. Again, computer subroutines, the context doesn't matter. Whether the person who's writing it is drinking coffee or tea, or whether it's rainy or not, doesn't matter. For eggs also, it's a relatively controlled environment. In hard problems, in contrast, like diagnosing the cause of a persistent cough or other things that involve either multiple causes or social context, the desired outcome in a given context is not known, and it's going to be difficult to observe. And there are many relevant contexts that could impact the outcome. And because there is no easy outcome metric, we don't know what's a successful recommendation. We can't even learn from expert workers because we don't know who the expert workers are. In the case of, computer subroutines, GPT-4, in fact, GPT-3 were trained on Stack Overflow. Why? Because in Stack Overflow, you had computer routines written by expert workers, and you knew these were expert workers, first of all, because they were upvoted by participants, and because their subroutines worked. In hard tasks, you cannot do that. So the current estimates, as well as the current tasks that have started being automated or at least exposed to AI, are mostly from this easy to learn category. But a lot of the future might be in the hard to learn tasks. How do we know? What can we do about this? Well, one thing we could do is we can go back to ONET and we can take the 4,089 tasks that Elundu et al. Identified as exposed, or we can do it for the whole set of tasks, but we don't need to do that for this paper. And we can try to classify them into easy versus hard tasks. The way we've done this is we first started by the verbs that are at the beginning of each task. The verbs can be, at least under reasonable assumptions, classified into hard and easy or uncertain verbs. Then use the integrated work activities, which describe the context. We also classify those into hard and easy, and then we run a latent Dirichlet allocation of all tasks on the basis of a variety of characteristics into clusters. And then we did a supervised learning algorithm to predict whether a subset of a training subset of tasks, which we hand coded as easy versus hard, to match on the basis of the verb characteristics, IWA characteristics, and LDA characteristics can be matched. Anyway, I can't go into too much detail, but it's a pretty straightforward routine. And when we do that, we end up that actually the majority of the tasks that are exposed at the moment are on the easy category, but there's still a hard category that's significant. So out of that 4.6, about 3.3 is easy. The remainder, just about 1.2, are hard. And then extrapolating from Noy and Zhang, which look at easier tasks, and Brynjolfsson, Lee, and Raymond, which look at intermediate easiness tasks, I estimate about 7% labor cost savings or 4.5% total cost savings in hard tasks. So if you combine those, then you get about 0.5 percentage point increase in TFB within 10 years. So not anything close to the kind of optimistic predictions that are out there. Now, new tasks which reorganize production, introduce new products, new tasks in the production process could be revolutionary. I'll come back to this at the end and give you my take for why I don't think we're going to see much new tasks that are going to be so revolutionary in the next 10 years. But we are seeing some new products that are AI driven. Though in those cases, I'm going to argue that these new tasks are also going to have some manipulative features like deepfakes, manipulation, misinformation, new social media strategies that can increase the addiction of social media. So I'll talk a little bit about how to incorporate these. And I think you can do that theoretically, but let me just jump into putting some numbers. There's a very nice recent paper by Leo Burstein, Benjamin Hendel, Christopher Roth, and co-authors that look at the case of social media with college students, in particular Instagram and TikTok. They find a reported willingness to pay of about $53 on average for being on social media per month. But when they give people the option of going off social media while also they can get other people off social media, even the users report that they're willing to pay $19 not to be on social media together with their friends not being on social media. So what that means is that while everybody else is using it to say they are addicted or they are creating a collective trap, each user on average will pay $53 per month to the company. So that's $53 addition to their revenue and to GDP. Actually, the net effect is about $19 negative on welfare. So if you take these numbers seriously, and there are many reasons why these are definitely not the last word, it means that for every dollar of revenue, there could be up to a 36 cents welfare damage. And then a minimal counting of activities where this could be happening is about 2% of US GDP. So what you get then is that you could get something like AI-powered new products could add another 2% to GDP or something like that, but actually the net effect on welfare would be negative, quite substantially negative, about 3/4 of a percentage point. All right, finally to wage and inequality implications. Now here, I'm not going to extend the framework to include multiple different types of labor. This is what my paper with Pasquale Restrepo in Econometrica does. I'll just take the equation from that paper. And let me explain this equation. It says the real wage change of a demographic group G, for example, college-educated, white, native-born men of a certain age group, is going to be given by a productivity effect, by some industry shifts. Sigma is again the elasticity of substitution, but it's not an endogenous object. The displacement that they experience because of AI. So I am here explicitly focusing on automation. We can talk about how to incorporate task complementarities here, but the data that Elundu et al. Or other people have right now does not enable distinction between task complementarity and automation. So that's why I've looked at overall cost savings so far. And then this whole thing is pre-multiplied by the column vector of this theta matrix, which is the propagation matrix. This propagation matrix essentially captures the general equilibrium effect of the sort that I was talking about in the introduction, when a particular demographic group is displaced from their work, either because labor productivity increases and tasks are complements, or because of automation. What happens? They have to go and look for other jobs. As they look for other jobs, they're competing against other demographic groups, so they're creating substitution effects. So this propagation matrix is something we derive its theoretical properties, etc. In the Econometrica paper, is a way of effectively summarizing all of these things locally. So this equation applies in my model here as well. And so the question is, how can I estimate that? Well, this is a productivity effect that comes from Halton's theorem. This I'm going to take from the estimates in my paper with Pasquale. That was for robotics, advanced machinery, software systems. There may be some differences, but it's not, this propagation matrix is not technology dependent, except depending on where you are locally. And these are the displacement effect if this is automation, which I'm going to use the exposure measures that I have used so far. And then these induced industry shifts are computed from the productivity effects and these displacement effects internally because of the substitution between industries. So here is the first figure. This is who is exposed to AI when I rank in different demographic groups according to their hourly wage in 2020s, essentially between 2018 and 2022, so that I have enough observations for some of the smaller demographic groups. There are 500 demographic groups here, distinguished by education. You can see that from the color coding. Gender, age, ethnicity, and whether an individual is US born or an immigrant. What you see here is that there is quite widespread and equal exposure to AI across different groups. This is very different from our econometric paper, where the same figure showed much more variation on the vertical axis. This is the basis of my claim in the introduction that the effects of AI are going to be more equally distributed. But notice there are still some variations here, and especially for the green group, and I'll come back to that, and the red group, high school dropouts and high school graduates. So here is a different way of seeing that. This is the direct task displacement from my paper with Pascual. This is the exposure to easy tasks, exposure to hard tasks. So you don't have this inequality, especially falling on the shoulders of low education groups. In fact, college graduates are the most exposed group, as you can see here. As a result, you're not going to get here the big inequality effects that Pascual and I estimated for previous automation technologies. So the baseline estimates is about a little bit more than a 1% growth within 10 years in the real wages of workers without a high school degree, a little bit less than that for high school degree and postgraduates. The group that's doing worst is the bachelor's degree when I look at everybody with the same education. Why is that? The productivity effect is uniform. The industry shifts are not really impacting anything. This is the direct effect of displacement. And then these are the ripple effects that come from the propagation matrix. So this is already fairly equal. This was much more unequal when you look at pre-AI. So can we say that AI is actually reducing inequality? Actually not. If you look at this, you'll see that there's actually a slight increase in inequality across demographic groups. And in fact, there are some groups that are really losing out. Who are they? It turns out it's the low education women. For the pre-AI technologies, the burden fell a lot on men, low education men. For AI, these estimates suggest it's going to be low education, especially native-born white women who are expected to have negative wage increases. All right, let me summarize. Oh, and then one other thing. Here is the total GDP estimate, 0.16. Why? Capital stock increases. Inequality between capital and labor increases a lot. And that's related. You can see the average wage increases by quite a bit less than 1 percentage point. GDP increases by about 1.5 percentage points. So this gap is going to capital. So the capital labor income is increasing. And by the way, this is what's relevant for welfare. This is not relevant for welfare. Here, for example, you have the increased energy costs of generative AI models. So this is the welfare relevant thing without the bad new tasks that I talked about, manipulative activities. Simple economic theory puts a lot of discipline. The Halton's theorem is very useful, and it applies in this setup as in other setups that people have used it. If you use that and take existing estimates, you're not going to get anything much more than 3/4 or 0.5 percentage point increase in TFP within 10 years, or less than 0.07% annual TFP growth. GDP effects are somewhat larger, but that's not relevant for welfare. No evidence of AI reducing inequality, but no major increase in inequality either, because AI exposed tasks are more equally distributed, but low education women are expected to experience some wage declines, non-trivial increase in the gap between capital and labor income. The future after 10 years, perhaps revolutionary changes in scientific innovation process, I'm not sure. Also new tasks, perhaps. Why not? Why did I not talk about new tasks? First of all, I couldn't do it because there's no way of estimating what AI will do to new tasks. But more importantly, and this has been a key point of my work, including work with Pasquale Restrepo, work with Simon Johnson and David Otter, that the current direction of AI is not going towards creating these good new tasks. Refocusing on socially beneficial directions will require very significant regulations and new laws. It will also require a major change in the industry. My argument in another context, which is broader than this, is that, in fact, we may need a change in the basic architecture of generative AI, which has this basic architecture, I think, is ill-suited to generate worker complementary or human complementary advances. It's been imposed on the industry because of their AGI obsession. And I think it's going to become more and more of a constraint on the productivity gains from AI, but that goes beyond the current paper. But I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A and the broader discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Daron. Some interestingly tiny numbers there. Benoit, I'd like to invite you to respond.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for inviting me to discuss this important paper. I think the paper is very timely as AI is everywhere in the policy discussion. It raises expectations which are, I think it's fair to say that the expectations are disproportionate with the current economic significance of AI or the current economic footprint of AI. And so calibrating the macro implications is also a way to help budget the time that policymakers should spend on the issue. And the conclusion here is maybe policymakers should spend less time than they currently do. And also I like the paper being both reasonable and conservative. Reasonable in the sense that there are many equilibrium effects in the economy which are taken on board, like the propagation matrix, the task complementarity, and so on. But still, it's very conservative in that it sees AI as incremental technical change and not as a quantum leap. And so the positive view is that there is a lot of upside, in fact. If we see the kind of disruptive innovations that Daron doesn't have in the paper, but that others would expect to be generated by AI, there might be a case for upside surprises also on the macro side. So I'm not going to discuss a lot the labor market issues, but I would like to focus on some of the plumbing issues in the economy that could make even Daron's numbers not materialize. So what could go wrong? What could go wrong here? My only question on the labor market side, Daron, but it's more a question of just to check if I understood the whole model well, would be that if you focus on the last results that you've shown with the propagation matrix and all that, and the impact being stronger on low education females, while the impact of previous technological change was more on low education males. Maybe one way to sum it up is that it's an innovation that will impact services rather than manufacturing, while previous waves of innovation have impacted manufacturing. And that's maybe just an easy way to cut through the results of the model. Now, what could go wrong? I think the productivity gains that are identified in the paper are conditional on two conditions. First, the AI industry staying the innovation course, keeping innovating, and then AI-driven innovation being adopted and exploited throughout the economy. And these are two separate conditions. And there are many things here that could go wrong, and which already make for a very lively discussion, particularly among antitrust authorities, which have been discussing a lot these issues recently. So where are the choking points that we can see here? I would make a difference between risks along the AI value chain, so narrowly in the AI production process, from estimating the foundation model to using it, through fine-tuning it and so on, and risks to adoption in the broader economy. And first, when you focus on the AI value chain, I think when you compare AI with previous waves of technological changes, one should keep in mind that this is a rare instance maybe not a unique instance, but a rare instance, where you have a potentially disruptive innovation which is already controlled at an early stage by incumbents. And that's rather new. You would expect innovation to be invented in basements by nerds in basements, and here it's already controlled to a large extent by big tech companies who have privileged access to the key inputs that are needed in the AI production process, and that is data, that is computational power, that is cloud services, the supply of cloud services, that is skills, of course, talent, and there are very few people who can actually design and train a foundation model, and money, of course. And this creates returns to scale in different ways. You have a high entry cost. That's capacity investment in data storage, in GPUs or TPUs, and so on. You have pecuniary externalities because the success of your AI products will depend on the breadth of your AI and cloud marketplaces, for instance, and that gives an edge to existing players. And you have network effects, such as among the talents who know how to train and to design foundation models. And then you have learning by doing, of course, through data, which is the obvious part of it. Accumulating data to help your model learn and become better. And so large big tech companies controlling these inputs can allow them to cement their market power, to foreclose the market for foundation models, and also to extract value vertically from downstream users by, say, for instance, by bundling AI services and other services. So in antitrust jargon, there is a risk of both exclusionary abuse and exploitative abuse in that case. It's not at all a theoretical discussion. We already see a lot of these features playing out in the cloud services industry. At the French Competition Authority, we published a report last year on cloud services, where a lot of these effects were already there and identified by market participants. And there are, of course, other risks associated with market power in the AI industry, which we're not discussing today, but which are political risks, for instance. Risks of controlling, manipulating elections, steering the public discussion, capturing the regulatory process. We see a little bit of that already today, and so on. That's all about upstream generative AI. Another area of concern is lack of transparency in the collection and use of data being used to train and to fine-tune the models. So data being publicly available doesn't mean that doesn't imply that it's free of rights. And as a matter of fact, at the French Competition Authority, a few weeks ago we fined Google 250 million euros for not informing press publishers of their articles being used to train Bard, now called Gemini, and also for not giving publishers an effective opt-out from using their data to train the model, contrary to French law and to European law. So that's all about upstream risks, that is risk in training the models and fine-tuning the models. And now you also have downstream risks at company level and individual level, users level. And here I would be more optimistic, probably because the variable cost of using a foundation model is much smaller than the cost of training the model in the first place. And also because there will be lots of use cases and different types of data that will be used to fine-tune the models, depending on industries. So you can need AI to be trained on manufacturing data, on health data, on education data, and so on and so forth. And part of this data will be proprietary. It will be provided by the companies themselves, by the clients themselves, and so that will not and controlled by the clients, and that will not entail the same kind of learning by doing effect that you have at the stage of training the model. What I'm saying here is, if you want the TFP gains to materialize and to be disseminated across the economy, you will need strong antitrust policy specifically on AI. And in addition to that, you also have risks to the broader competitive process, and that's about diffusion to the broader economy. And I think an underestimated aspect of the AI discussion in the policy sphere, particularly in the antitrust sphere, is that you need to watch out not only what's going on in the foundation model or LLM space, but you also need to understand how AI will change industry structures in different industries. And we are at stage 0 of understanding how that's going to happen. And maybe not a lot will happen, which would be consistent with Daron's model. But if a lot happens, we need to anticipate how the competition dynamics will be changed in areas such as health or education. We know very little about that. My last comment here is it's another unknown, but it's a known unknown, so that's the good news. Is that we know very little on how the development of AI will impact the economics of data, and that also can have broader consequences throughout the economy and macro consequences. Data is generally assumed to be, by economists, to be non-rival, of course. But what we see with the rise of generative AI is that it creates a new universe of data which may still be non-rival in nature, but it's excludable, right? So that you're going to have contracts between companies or, say, press publishers and AI companies. We already see some of it. And also we will see foundation models being fine-tuned on proprietary data, which is not meant to be used broadly. So what are the consequences here? First, there will be issues with data interoperability or functional equivalence, which we already see in the cloud space. I don't personally think it's a big issue today. We don't seem to see obstacles for companies to multi-home, that is to use at the same time in parallel or in conjunction, say, Copilot and Gemini. That doesn't seem to be a big hurdle because the APIs are good enough to do that. But that's certainly something that will need to be watched in the future. Where we will, there could be more concerns is that here we are kind of chasing different policy objectives. You have the incumbents wish to protect their data, because training a foundation model, it's not a science, it's an art. And it's not only about the data, but also about the way you use the data to train the model. And there is a lot of specific value added and specific skills here. So the incumbents will fight for this to be protected. Not only data, but data-related skills. But on the other hand, you have the need to maintain access to data to allow for new entrants to enter the market. And then on top of that, you have privacy requirements and copyright requirements, which are different legal domains. And so the key balancing act for policymakers will be how to balance between these different priorities to ensure a reasonable level of entry in the market while protecting privacy and copyrights. And we don't have the answers to that. And if we want to answer that.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to discuss Daron's paper. I'm actually not far from him now. I'm also at MIT visiting. So, the context, as we all know, is that the development of LLM has led to even more attention on the potential of AI in transforming our economy. And on one hand, you have some people that go as far as predicting some form of singularity. Daron cited the number of Goldman Sachs and McKinsey. Those are pretty large numbers. I asked ChatGPT what it thinks it could achieve. So ChatGPT 3.5 was predicting 1 percentage point to GFP growth or more. And ChatGPT 4 was predicting 0.5 percentage points to 2.5 percentage points GFP growth. Then I tried to make ChatGPT a little smarter by telling it that it should be informed by Daron's research. And so you can read the answer there. So, but it's not too bad, right? Things that Daron will think that it's important to think about how to have policies to address inequality, labor market transition, other social impacts that you need to change a little bit the way in which AI is directed, but it's not that good because it seems to think that Daron will not deny the potential productivity gains. Okay. So basically what the paper here does is some informed back of the envelope computation to ground the type of estimate that we've seen in reality. And the paper at the end of the day predicts relatively modest gains. So less than 0.71%, thinking that this is an upper bound over 10 years. And as Daron explained, the intuition just boils down to Elton theorem. You look at what is the share of tasks that are going to be affected. That corresponds to around 4.4% of GDP. And then you look at what is cost saving. Some estimate is around 15%. You multiply the two, and you get a number. So this 0.71. And then I think the first question is really how small is that number actually? So if you think about it, then US TFP growth between 1990 and 2019, so just before COVID, is 0.65%. So 0.71 is just basically adding 1 year out of 10 years. This is actually this is in fact quite significant, okay? Which also perhaps tells you that if you estimate that if your lower bound estimate is that you're going to double TFP, then your lower bound estimate is pretty high. Okay, so this ChatGPT number seems quite off. So that's the first part on productivity. I'll focus most of my discussion on that. There is an additional part which is on inequality, and where basically we see that AI exposed tasks are quite widely distributed, so we should not really see much changes in inequality in either direction. So of course, to get to these numbers, there are a lot of somewhat heroic assumptions that need to be made here and there. But the important point is that is to start with a framework that allows to ground the discussion in reality, and then it becomes much easier to just start discussing about whether that number here is an overestimate or that number there is an underestimate. So this is where I think is really the value added of the paper, like thinking about the frameworks that can start a discussion. And just to provide one example in which we maybe can start disagreeing or not. So as Daron explained, he uses these estimates of Svanberg et al., which are based on what is the share of tasks that are exposed to AI for computer vision that can actually be profitably automated. Number is something like 23%. But you could perhaps think that actually over time, with the cost of labor going up, the cost of computing perhaps going down, then maybe in fact a lot of these tasks end up being automated, will be profitably automated. And then if you were to remove this 23%, go up to the thinking that maybe every task there is going to be automated, then you go from 0.71% to 3%. This is over 10 years, so this is still quite low compared to the estimate that you see there, or the Goldman Sachs estimates. So what I'm going to do next is kind of discuss some additional reason for perhaps pessimism. In fact, going a little bit with some similarities with what Benoit said. And then I go back to some of the elements in the framework and that Daron developed, and he's still staying within the same framework, whether there are some reason perhaps for a little bit more optimism. So the first thing that I would point out, and that Benoit mentioned, is that these numbers basically assume that everywhere that AI can diffuse is going to diffuse within 10 years. Okay. This is, of course, quite optimistic, and this is because Daron is trying to provide, in fact, an upper bound. In reality, we know that the diffusion of technology tends to follow this type of S curve, right? And so it's pretty small, and then it accelerates, and then eventually nearly everybody has it. Taking sources from another of Daron's paper, like in 2019, only 1.5% of businesses had invested in AI, right? So this is kind of relatively small. And in fact, there is a recent literature that suggests that the time for diffusion, the time for technical diffusion within firms, not for consumer product, but for within firms, seems to be it seems to be taking more time for technology to diffuse. So There's in particular these studies by the OECD with Andrews and Cruz-Crollo that kind of document that the gap between frontier firms and laggard firms seems to be widening over time. So this is taken from Calvino and Cruz-Crollo, and this blue line is essentially labor productivity for the top 5% firms compared to the non-frontier firms. And you can see this gap widening between year 2001 and 2017. This is true in manufacturing. This is true in services. So again, we could expect slow diffusion there. So going back now to Daron's framework, basically, we start from production functions that looks like this. We have a bunch of tasks. Eventually, these tasks here below I are going to be produced with capital, and the tasks here below above I, sorry, this should be from I to N, are going to be produced with labor. And Daron argues that we should think of AI as improving those gamma L's here. So we're going to make labor more productive, and we're also perhaps going to change the gamma K here around the threshold I. So that will mean automating. We're going to have some tasks that were produced by labor that are now going to be produced by machines. So if you're going with that, then basically what you're ignoring is a possibility that AI will improve capital productivity on tasks that are already automated. So this is increasing gamma K for tasks below I here. Okay. So is this, this seems perhaps a surprising assumption. Is it a reasonable assumption? So I think there are like some reasons for why that makes sense, right? Because if you think of what AI does, or a lot of AI does, is just actually imitating labor. We try to reproduce what humans are achieving. And well, if humans are not producing the tasks, then you don't have data on what the humans are doing in the first place. So perhaps this makes a lot of sense. This will mean also that you have a lot of contrast between this type of technological change and other automation technologies, right? So if you think, for instance, of computer and numerical control machine tools, then they were used in part to improve on previous types of machine tools. So that was more changing gamma K on partly already automated tasks. But it is a case, however, that there are already quite a bit of attempts to see whether we can combine AI and existing machines. So one example is Amazon's plan on spending $1 billion in companies that are combining AI and robotics, and that would presumably increase gamma K over a broad range of tasks. Some of them being, directly automation. So within the framework that Daron, within the type of that here Daron said corresponded to what AI can do, but some of them could also apply to tasks that are already automated. Here's just another example from the MIT news of another attempt to kind of combine AI with robotics. Another reason for why you could see, perhaps a bit more optimism is the role of AI in innovation. So this is something that I mentioned as well. So we have already seen AI being used in research. Okay, and that kind of makes AI quite different from, again, robots, for instance. There's this company AlphaFold that can manage to predict protein folding, which can have large application in medicine and research. Moderna actually used AI in the development of the COVID vaccine. There is even some example of AI being used to prove mathematical theorems. Now, if you change the innovation production function, that can be extremely transformative, but it takes a lot of time because innovation is you're changing the flow at which growth, the flow of ideas. It's going to take a lot of time before this really materializes in changing kind of the overall amount of GDP or overall productivity. A last thing that I want to briefly mention is whether AI can be associated with the creation of new products. So not necessarily the new tasks that Daron talked about, but actually new products, which would perhaps correspond to an increase in B in the framework. There is here a very interesting recent paper by Babina, Fedike, and Hodson. And what they did there, they tried to measure the effect of AI on firm growth. So they measure AI at the firm level by looking at the number of people that are hired in AI jobs. And they found that firms that invested more in AI grew more. So one standard deviation in AI use was associated with 10-20% increase in sales. But what was interesting is that this came largely because of an increase in the number of products. So they found that these same firms 13% more trademark, 24% more product patents. And at the same time, that was not associated with an increase in process innovation, okay, which would be more in line with what we were discussing so far. Yeah, so basically, I think overall this is very nice paper that delivers probably more realistic prediction on the short-term effects of AI. And maybe something to remember is that if you think that AI can deliver 1 additional year of growth in the next 10 years, this is somewhat reasonable, perhaps a little bit optimistic. If you think that it's going to be much more than that, then this starts looking unreasonable.
Thank you, David. Before we get to any of the questions that you have in the room, Daron, I'd just like you to just respond to any of the comments.
Oh, thank you to both Benoit and David. They're excellent questions. I don't have any disagreements. I think in terms of just one comment from Benoit, yes, absolutely. This is services versus manufacturing. Is not all of it, but a large part of it. Manufacturing was a heavy automating industry before, and it's not where AI is having most of its effects. And there is a gender difference between the employment compositions. And David, I completely agree on deepening of automation and robotics AI, but I don't think any of that is going to happen within a 10-year frame. And I think part of the reason for that is because for the robotics users of AI, you're going to need a lot more reliable AI, which will take a while. But of course, reasonable people could disagree on that.
Thank you. Admirably brief. Now, Anton, I'll come to you first of all.
Thank you. So Daron's framework is, of course, one of the cornerstones in this literature. But what I want to do is I want to question the assumptions a little bit. Daron, I think your estimate of 15% savings and 4.6% of tasks is probably in the right ballpark when it comes to the AI that we had in operation in 2023. But progress is happening really fast. And I want to emphasize, we are economists and we are good at judging the economic implications of technological developments. But if we listen to the AI researchers, even people like Jeff Hinton, one of the godfathers of AI, then they say two things about the technological developments. The first one is that the uncertainty is really tremendous. And the second one, that we may reach something that you called before the obsession of AI researchers, something like human-level AI, and that may be on the horizon, according to them, as soon as 3 to 5 years or maybe 20 years, nobody really knows, right? So if we economists take these technological predictions seriously, then the implications using precisely your framework are much different. So in one of my recent CEPR and NBR working papers, it's entitled Scenarios for the Transition to AGI. I look at these implications, and you can easily reach productivity effects that approach double digits. That's, of course, in a frictionless environment, and I agree that things may be drawn out much more. I just want to say that a lot depends on our technological scenarios, and I think we should at least give some credence to what the technology experts there are saying. Thank you.
Daron, do you want to respond to that?
Not much, meaning that, I think Anton is right, absolutely, that if we believe some technology experts, they are predicting wild changes, and I think the future is unknown, and perhaps within 30 years' time, there could be really transformative changes. But my understanding of these technologies, and Anton has a lot of expertise here as well, is that I don't think any of that is likely within 10 years, but that's the main disagreement.
Okay, thank you very much. Juan.
Yeah, thank you, Daron. Very, very nice presentation. I wonder if the dimension at which to apply Halter's theorem is the right one. As far as I understood, you take task weights and then apply gains in productivity and cost savings and so on. But when we compute employment and when we compute productivity, we use jobs, not tasks. And in the same way that your distinction between easy tasks and hard tasks is a very relevant one, there is a distinction between simple jobs and complex jobs. I mean, simple jobs is one job performing one task. Complex jobs is a job performing many, many tasks. So if you think that artificial intelligence is going to affect mostly simple jobs, then maybe there are some nonlinearities in the aggregation of the Halstein theorem that change the number a big deal, right? So you could do this computation because given that you have in ONET the composition of tasks for each particular job, for each particular occupation, you could take into account this distinction between simple jobs and complex jobs to do the computation, and maybe the numbers could be really different.
So thank you, Juan. Let me So the Halton's theorem and the version that I'm using is just first order. So the nonlinearities don't matter. So you could do that at the industrial level, at the job level, at the task level. There would all be equivalent because all of these Lagrange multipliers can be taken as given. So you can have very nonlinear, potential nonlinear things like, for example, indivisibilities of labor and complementarities, etc. As long as things are differentiable at the extensive margin, meaning workers, the Halton's theorem applies. Now you can go beyond Halton's theorem, beyond the first order approximation, and then these nonlinearities would matter a big deal. So that would be the second order expansion, and that's quite complicated in general. And if the changes that I was getting from the first order were large, I think there would be a bigger argument for worrying about the second order. Given that I'm getting a relatively small changes, my guess would be that the second order effects are small, but those are complicated.
David, would you like to make some comments on this? Because you did comment in you did make some comments about the heroic assumptions that are inevitable in any piece of work like this.
So my comment was more about the numbers that you put there than the framework. I think I agree that the framework is kind of a good way to start on. I mean, the way in which I understood what Daron was doing is that this was, once the tasks were you match the tasks directly to GDP. So I don't think there was like a particularly strong concern that some jobs may correspond to just one task and another job correspond to many tasks. At the end of the day, this was just all translated in dollars. So then I don't think there was I don't think this was a big problem. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Well, thanks for making such a complicated set of calculations for the U.S. economy. But what I would like you to tell us is if we can start thinking about beyond the U.S., not Europe, but the whole world. So you have a pretty good understanding of what it does according to skills and education and gender. Can you speculate, or you will be perfectly entitled not to speculate, but what does it mean for growth in Africa, in Latin America, and for international trade?
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, I did this for the US because the estimates are for the US. But my guess is that, for France, it wouldn't be too different in terms of because task distribution would not be too different. But the developing world is a wild card. And that's actually the place where we know very little, and your policymakers themselves are very uninformed, except for a few businesses. Businesses are very much behind the curve. But even more importantly, I think the main axis of uncertainty is the type of AI technologies. So the issue that I raise, for example, in my book with Simon Johnson is that AI for the developing world could be the mother of all inappropriate technologies. If AI goes in the direction of economizing on, low and middle skill labor, for many developing economies, not all, but for many developing economies, that's their main comparative advantage. So then it could change the international division of labor in a way that's really disadvantageous for low income. On the other hand, if it goes in a different way, for example, it it boosts expertise, expands the set of tasks that people can do without having, the kind of training that European universities provide, the language skills that domestic workers have, etc. It could also expand the things that workers in Indonesia and India can do. So it's very much up for grabs, that the future for developing countries. That being said, I emphasize the mother of all inappropriate technologies in the book and in some of my other writing, precisely because I think that the current direction, which is emphasizing automation, will have the more of the adverse effects on the developing world. Again, not in every country, but more broadly speaking, on all the developing world. And in fact, that's another policy direction, because I would say, as important as the really leading and very important work that European policymakers are playing in the debate on AI, we need a voice from the developing world. And it's unlikely to be the voice of Mexico, the voice of Brazil, the voice of Indonesia. So it requires some sort of international organization to play the role of aggregator of developing countries' voice to bring it to the table for AI discussions, which is currently absent. So a very important issue.
It is. Benoit, you have some comment for Europe?
Yeah, I wanted to actually pick on the same international discussion. And it's a very important discussion because it will have an impact not only on convergence or divergence between countries, but also on international trade, on international capital flows, and also on, if you moving to the political economy, on the possibility to have an international consensus on AI regulation. And if different countries have different interests, that's not going to happen. There will be no international consensus. So I think that's a very important discussion. I would be slightly more pessimistic than Daron when it comes to the US and Europe, because I think implicit to the model, you have a capacity to reallocate work, you have a capacity to reallocate tasks that presumably is larger in the US than in Europe. So here, I think labor market institutions will matter a lot, and there are differences between the US and Europe.
Thank you. Any more questions immediately in the room here? Okay, I have a question then, in that case. If we are coming to the conclusion, at least in the next 10 years, that AI isn't really going to move the needle on productivity, is there perhaps the problem that the economics profession is over-focusing on AI at the moment when there are other policies that we know would move the needle? For example, better childcare. And that AI is taking rather too much of our attention. Not in this session, of course, because this is what it's all about. but when we finish it. Daron, first of all, you.
Well, I would say, both policymakers in the US, journalists in the US, and academics, especially in economics, paid too little attention to AI in the late 2010s. And then, ChatGPT is a very impressive technology, but it's also a huge success in hype. And that has all sort of swung the pendulum to the other part. So it's a corrective. So I think it's great. I can tell you, European policymakers, I think, were ahead. But when I spoke to American lawmakers just 4 years ago, they were woefully uninformed and unprepared. And today it's a complete sea change. Their staffers are on the ball. They understand the concern. They understand the concerns. They've read the literature. So that corrective has really worked very well in terms of lawmakers to some degree. And I think that's a good corrective that's happening within economics as well, that there is now a dense economics of AI literature. But I would say it would be good if we became a little bit more grounded, because I think as a profession, we are being infused by the excess enthusiasm in the tech industry and the journalists as well. And I think if we are realistic, it's going to be better. But by the way, I also would add, some people have asked me whether there is a contradiction between saying AI is not going to have major macroeconomic productivity effects and my other concerns about AI inequality, AI misinformation, and so on and so forth. And absolutely not. I think the worst of possible worlds, which I think is not an unlikely world, in which AI doesn't have the productivity benefits that are promised, but is still adopted and creates a lot of damage, both in terms of inequality, social cohesion, democracy, and so on. So I think that is a point estimate. I would attach pretty high point estimate to that unfortunate outcome. Okay,
thank you. David, do you have an opinion on this?
Yes, I mean, I agree with Daron. I don't think that even if the productivity gains are not enormous, I think it's true we should still study AI. So as Daron said, there may be also negative consequences. We've talked about market concentration earlier. That's also one important aspect. And I would not. These numbers are not huge, but they're not negligible. I mean, once again, if you increase GFP growth by 10%, that's really not nothing. And we could expect a bigger effect, not in 10 years, but in 20 or 30 years as well. So I think it makes sense to study this if we also want to make sure that AI is directed towards more productive innovation. So it could be, for instance, clean technology could be one thing. So creation of new tasks could be another. Then as well, there is actually room for governmental policy, and that's something where economists can be useful. And finally, if economists don't talk about this, then others may talk about it, and maybe more extreme numbers would be more part of what everybody believes. So that's also a problem. So I think.
Can I just make one comment? I mean, on that, Tim. I didn't comment on this after David's first rounds of comments, but since he repeated that, let me react to this. In my opinion, you shouldn't do the math of 0.7% as a 10% of TFP growth, because TFP growth is already in percentage points. So the base doesn't matter. TFP growth has a natural scale, and 0.07 TFP growth annual is a very small number. So whatever the base is, I don't think is relevant for that. So that's the sense in which I slightly disagree with David's framing. Of course, everything he's saying is correct, but the fact that TFP growth in the US has been slow, which is another failure of technology and market structure, by the way, doesn't make the numbers any more impressive, in my opinion.
Luckily, you can pop down the corridor afterwards and have a chat about that one and resolve it. Let us know. Benoit, for you, and then Emilio, I'll come to you after that.
No, I mean, first, I agree that a 0.7 impact on TFP is not negligible. I mean, it's a 1% impact on GDP, and there are many macro policies that we are discussing in conferences that have a less than 1% macro impact. I mean, we can discuss monetary policy for hours, and it usually will have a less than 1% macro impact on GDP. So it's still interesting. And second, one reason to discuss, I mean, as Daron said, there are many issues outside of macro, like the ethical dimensions of AI, which certainly deserve a discussion today, while it's still time. And lastly, it's still time to design the right regulation. I'm not saying that we're going to do that, but it's still time to do it. So we have a unique opportunity of acting early enough so that the regulatory framework will be the right one. And so let's not waste this opportunity.
Thank you. Emilio.
Yeah, so I have a question for Daron. I was wondering, how to connect your framework with this debate about, say, harnessing the power of AI kind of requires system-wide change. So what is the right way to think about this system-wide change in your framework? The idea being that, you know, once we figure out how to change how we produce things, then we will start doing the same things in different ways, and this kind of suggests me that, you know, basically these new tasks could be old tasks, right? So that kind of the reinstatement effect goes hand in hand with this displacement effect, and therefore that we might be kind of underestimating the amount of new tasks that we would get once again we figure out how to harness AI. What's your thought on this?
Yes, Emilio, thank you. I completely agree that one potential effect of AI would be to completely reorganize production, system-wide effects. And some people, including Tim Bershnahan and Joshua, AJ, and Avi, have emphasized those. In the most unrestricted form, you can think of that as like, we have a production function, we shift to a completely new production function, then it could be anything. But I would say that quite a bit of that flavor here is captured exactly like you were anticipating by new tasks, because new tasks are making the production process more efficient because they are creating complementarities with existing tasks. They may replace some of the old tasks or they may not. The way I did it here is they don't replace, they're additive. The way I do it in the work with Pasquale, it's that they are replacing existing tasks. That doesn't matter too much. But again, my assessment is that to do the bigger changes of these system-wide things, you need much more reliable and much more specialized AI models that are business specific in ways that at the moment we don't have. I'm pretty sure we're not going to have them in the next 2, 3, 4 years. Whether 10 years is the right horizon, or we may start seeing some of them before 10 years. Again, I think Anton and I may disagree, because if you have the kind of improvements in capabilities of LLM models, you may see those sooner. But again, the one thing I would say is that the kind of improvements you need are not compute power improvements or improvements in the cost of GPUs, because GPUs are used with the current architecture are just going to add another 500 billion parameters, but it's not going to change the overall architecture of the model. So if the constraint is architecture, then more GPU power may not be the thing that's going to get you within 10 years, the kind of more system-wide changes that you're referring to. And but of course, there are people who are working on generative AI with different architectures, but that's not where the center of gravity of the industry is right now.
Thank you. You did mention Anton. He did have one last question.
Yeah, so I agree on the architecture thing. Even though Daron and I have slightly different perspectives on the technological numbers, we actually very much share the same concerns. And so I wanted to ask you, Daron, would you mind sharing with us what are the directions in which you would redirect AI research if you could flip a switch as a social planner, so to say?
Let me give you one example of the kinds of things that I think would be super useful and really very beneficial in terms of both productivity and inequality, and also in the process explain why I think it's unlikely with the current architecture. So electricians, okay? In the United States, we have a shortage of electricians, and that shortage is going to get worse and worse as we attempt to electrify the grid. What do we need? We need better electricians, but even that's not enough. If you train more electricians, it's not going to be enough, because the problems that electricians are going to be required to deal with is going to get more varied. The equipment's going to get more advanced. The electricity grid is going to throw up new problems. So you need electricians that are better trained, more of them, and when they are on the job, they can get reliable, context-dependent, real-time information to do the troubleshooting and diagnosis and repair that they need to do. Generative AI could be great for that. It could be a training tool, so it could expand vocational skills training for electricians. it could provide exactly kind of real-time evidence, information, sorry. An irony of our current age, I say all the time, is that information is abundant. Just go on the internet. And useful information is scarce. Again, just go on the internet. Good luck finding the right information for really context-dependent, job-related performance. So the role of generative AI could be to provide the useful, scarce information in real time in a usable fashion. But you see, that would, first of all, not require large language models that can write Shakespearean sonnets. And it would really put the emphasis on context-dependent understanding and reliability. So these two legs are really the things that are weak in the current architecture. And that's why I think a big architectural change is necessary. But look at who the industry leaders are. Sam Altman wants to raise another $5 trillion. He will probably be able to do it. And that's doubling down on the current architecture.
Thank you very much. We are out of time, and we have a hard finish. So thank you very much to David, Benoit, and Daron. Daron, your paper is not publicly available yet, is it? Because it's still
it will be later today or tomorrow.
Ah, right. Okay, well, hold on for that then if you want to read more. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to everyone in the room. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. But most of all, thank you to our panelists. And we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, if I may, just a few words about the logistics that we're going to have, for those of you who have accepted the invitation, we're going to have dinner at the hotel